Yeah, hello. My name is Lena. I'm speaking for the OECD today. It's a pleasure to be here, and I thank Yale University and the organizers of this conference very much for inviting me. I'd like to share one of the most recent efforts of the OECD with you when it comes to illicit financial flows. We're about to publish a report on responses from OECD countries to illicit financial flows. So what we're doing here is basically to look at how OECD countries do when it comes to tackling illicit financial flows. When we started with this project, we realized that there was not really a source of comparative information and no analysis of what OECD countries do on this problem. At the same time, it's no surprise if I tell you that many of the illicit financial flows actually end up in OECD countries. So I think that's a really important topic. So the aim of this report is to measure the institutional, regulatory, and legal arrangements in OECD countries to address illicit financial flows, and then also to highlight areas in need of improvement. What we're not trying to do is measure how many or how much of the illicit financial flows is ending up where. It's more about policy and quantity. To give you a brief overview of the concept of illicit financial flows that we've put on the basis of our report, I have this overview here. On the left side, let me try that. You see the sources of illicit flows, then different methods, how they end up in the international system, and the countermeasures that are put in place. And this pretty much defined the focus of our report. We're looking at different issues related to illicit financial flows, which is money laundering, governed by AML standards, especially by the Financial Action Task Force, FATF, and their 40 recommendations. Second, the issue of tax evasion, and we already talked about this. The current topic there is exchange of information. The OECD hosted a global forum on exchange of information for tax purposes with follow-up reviews. Third, we have the topic of bribery, and this is governed by the OECD Convention Against Bribery. And fourth, asset recovery. So if the illicit financial flows have left the developing countries, how can we get them back? How can we recover them? There are several international initiatives there. And then fifth, what role development agencies can have, simply because they shape a lot of the discussion around that topic. So let's get started. I'd like to start with money laundering, because that's one of the main tools to detect and fight cross-border illicit financial flows. So if you have effective AML and CFT, counter-financing of terrorism regimes in place, you're also tackling a vast majority of the illicit financial flows. And what we've done here is to look at the 40 recommendations of FATF and how OECD countries perform. Do they comply? Don't they comply? We've built the average scores across all OECD countries, and that's what you see on this blue, hope you can see it, this blue receding line. The largest dips are those recommendations where OECD countries performed the worst. And I've lifted them out in the orange and red boxes. And if you see what they're about customer due diligence, they're about politically exposed persons, customer due diligence by designated non-financial businesses and professions. And those are all areas that are of really significant relevance for illicit financial flows and for tackling them. And OECD countries performing not very well, if you ask me. So let's take a closer look at that. What you see here are the OECD compliance scores from the previous charts, the ones that were lifted out. But instead of the average, we have the numbers, how many countries complied, how many countries did not comply. And basically the message is red and orange is bad, yellow and green is good. So we said that if a country largely complies, that counts as a passing score. If it only partially complies, or if it's non-compliant, then we say they don't meet the standards according to FATF. And I think that's pretty alarming what we see here. On the topic of customer due diligence, it's this graph, we see that over 80% do not get this passing score. If you look at beneficial ownership, it's similar. It's a little bit better when it comes to legal persons, but it's really devastating when it comes to the availability of beneficial ownership information for legal arrangements. Only 10% get that passing score, 10%. And a similar issue when it comes to customer due diligence for non-financial businesses and professions, only 3% are compliant. So you see there's lots of room for improvement there. I'd like to note at this point that these compliance scores that we see here, we took from a FATF mutual evaluation report. And there are at least 7 countries that had follow-up reviews since then. So there is some improvement since these numbers were put together, but they're not all at the same levels, and FATF hasn't assigned new ratings yet. So this is the latest rating that we have from FATF. Let's compare countries. I think that's also really interesting, but of course OECD countries were not really happy about this attempt. You can do that in different ways. You can count what country complied with how many recommendations, which is what we have on the left. You can count what country does not comply with how many recommendations. That's what we have in the middle here. Or you can assign a numerical value and build averages for every country. This is what we have on the right side. And the message is pretty clear. We have the same countries that don't comply, that show very low levels of compliance, no matter what strategy you apply here. Let's get to the topic of tax evasion. That's on the international agenda, and of course a necessary element for combating international illicit financial flows. Automatic exchange of information is becoming the new standard. The G8 and G20 have endorsed that, and we're currently working at the OECD to get that rolling and to work out the technical strategies and processes to do that. But so far, the common way to do it is to have exchanging information agreements and to exchange information on demand. So obviously you can't see many details on this really small table, but what I want to highlight here is that one of the major issues, if you look at how countries open information when it relates to tax information, we have the same issue as we had before. Ownership is, again, one of the issues where you just simply can't get information. Everything else is actually pretty good. It's all pretty green. So there are exchange of information agreements in place. Countries exchange information. But when it comes to beneficial ownership, again, as we saw before, a lot of countries are not complying with the international standards. So there are a number of exchange of information agreements in place between OECD countries and developing countries, which are of course important if you want to tackle illicit financial flows. You have to have a robust network of agreements. This is all on the bilateral level, and these are the numbers for exchange of information agreements signed since the launch of the Global Forum in 2002. We're at 1,300 agreements so far, and there are more underway. So this is as of September 2013. Now let's look at this figure. This shows us how many of these agreements on exchange of information, of tax information, are complying with the Global Forum standard. since 2005, actually, because then the Global Forum International Standard was changed significantly to make it even harder to refuse to share information. And I think that's really encouraging. The numbers are rising and they're continuously closing more agreements. And finally, a breakdown per country. Almost all countries, or let's put it differently, all countries have some sort of exchange of information agreement in place, but not so many of these agreements actually comply with the Global Forum standard that we'd like to see. There are some countries who don't have a compliant agreement at all, and it could be much more. However, what is encouraging to see is that even if countries do not comply with the international standards they agreed to in general, if there is political will, we still have exchange of information agreements, and that is, I think, one of the key messages as well, that the political will needs to be there, otherwise you won't have agreements at all. A quick look at international bribery, simply because that's also one of the key topics when it comes to illicit financial flows, one of the main drivers, of course. And combating corruption should be one of the priorities, of course. These are figures from the OECD Working Group on Bribery, and they show how many parties have been sanctioned in connection with foreign bribery cases. These numbers are from 1999 between 2011 and 2012. We have 222 individuals and 90 legal entities sanctioned in criminal proceedings only for foreign bribery. At least 83 of the sanctioned individuals were given prison terms. 44 individuals and 95 legal entities have been sanctioned in other legal proceedings related to, not necessarily predicate offenses, but other offenses related to bribery. We have 320 investigations going on still in 24 states, and against 106 individuals, and in 15 states we had criminal charges levied. One way to counter illicit financial flows is to recover and repatriate stolen assets. This is important, I think, because it provides additional resources. Yale already mentioned that the aid budgets have gone down, and I think if we were to recover a lot of the outflow out of developing countries, we could mitigate that at least a little bit. Second, it has a huge deterrent effect if you have this big symbol of repatriating stolen assets. And then, because it denies corrupt leaders their loot, asset recovery can also be seen as a way of providing justice to the victims and to the people in the countries that have illicit outflows. There were two progress reports by OECD and STAR, the Initiative for Asset Recovery by UNDP and the World Bank. Between 2006 and 2009, that was the first progress report, we had 5 countries that froze more than $1 billion. 4 countries returned assets, and the number for that is 270 million, not billion, only 270 million were returned between 2006 and 2009. But only around 20 million ended up in developing countries. That is also a message. What we see here are the numbers for the second evaluation report for the period between 2010 and 2012. We have almost 1.4 billion in frozen assets in this time period, a large part coming from Switzerland, another large part from the United Kingdom. And then we have 130 million returned to the countries of origin, but only by 3 countries in this period. A word on this. This does not include the assets that were frozen in connection with the Arab Spring or with Libya in particular, because we're not sure yet whether that's actually falling under the classical asset recovery or whether there are other definitions. But these numbers are actually much lower if you were to take those numbers into account. Nevertheless, what we can see on the issue of asset recovery is that many of our member countries are capable of quick and decisive action in this area. This is a stock take of the measures in place for asset recovery. And if you analyze this and also look at the figures, you arrive at a set of recommendations. You see that it is extremely effective and necessary if you have enough resources in place. The countries that have adequate resources also are the ones freezing and returning more assets. Very simple. Also, secondly, it's very important to have laws in place that allow for rapid tracing, freezing, and return. If you have a slow system in place and it takes forever to actually identify the assets and then freeze them, the ones who stole them might get away with it. They will probably know that there is something going on, so they will try to transfer the funds out of the place where you have just identified them. So to do that, you need non-conviction-based asset forfeiture, and you need to be able to allow for the freeze of assets when a foreign jurisdiction is asking you to do it. And third, an important measure is to allow for civil action. So a lot of the asset recovery is based on criminal actions, but in some cases it has been much more useful to just have a civil trial and then freeze the assets as a result from that. An important role do aid agencies play because they are often part of the international initiatives which we see in this table. They also supported the initial research on the agenda. I think that's an important topic that Gail already touched upon. The donors are also the drivers behind many of the programs we see to counter illicit financial flows and the various transparency initiatives. So for example, the Oslo dialogue, publish what you pay is another thing. So based on the findings of the previous chapters and then consultations with donor agencies, we see these potential avenues for an increased engagement by development agencies on illicit financial flows. First of all, of course, we need to build up relevant capacities in development agencies. We did another survey of donor agencies where we saw that many of them don't have customer due diligence measures in place themselves. So if the agencies don't pay attention who they're giving their money to, how should we prevent that the money is actually ending up in some dark channels? Second, we need to build capacities in the developing countries. Developing countries need to be able to investigate themselves, and they need to be able to understand complex arrangements such as transfer pricing, arrangements by multinational corporations. We also need to encourage developing countries to comply with the global standards. Some of them do already, but I think that's a two-way street. The rules are universal and they work everywhere. And finally, we should support the research agenda on illicit financial flows, build political commitment. As I mentioned earlier, that's the central point. Even if you have rules in place, that doesn't mean that they're actually adhered to. You need to have the political will for this. And lastly, we need to ensure that in the current efforts on those global initiatives, we always have the development dimension in the current efforts. Yeah, that's the end of my presentation so far. We're in the midst of rooting out all the typos and errors in the report, but it should be ready next week, and I'm happy to send it anybody who's interested a copy once we're ready with it. And if you have questions, let me know. Thank you for your attention.